Welcome to the first lesson of this mini course, Communications 101. And if you're watching this video, hopefully you're already wondering what else you might try to improve your ability to communicate effectively in China. This is a great mindset to have, so let's begin. What do you think are the biggest misperceptions regarding communications in China or with Chinese people? Are you aware of any misperceptions that you've had in the past? Did you say something inappropriate or something you wish you could take back? Even if people understand or forgive you for saying something stupid, keep in mind that there are no takebacks when it comes to making an impression. In cross-cultural communications, it's important to eliminate as many misperceptions as possible. So I'm going to share with you some of the biggest misperceptions I've observed over the past 20 years doing business in China. These are misperceptions that many foreigners have, including myself, before I too was able to learn some valuable lessons. First, China is not homogeneous. Within mainland China, there are 56 officially recognized ethnic groups, and they all have their own language, food, and culture. China has also classified their cities by tiers according to population, and as you get to the lower tier cities, not only are the attitudes different, especially towards foreigners, but even the rules and regulations are different. Consider that a first tier city resident has many privileges that lower tier city residents do not. Age also dramatically segments the Chinese population with different values, attitudes, and behaviors. Even Chinese classify themselves according to the decade in which they were born. This is why we also say that China is a land of contradictions, because this happens when you expect all Chinese to share a similar culture. But I believe the biggest misperception is the context of face, or mianzi. This is a term we've all heard about, but even myself, sometimes it's difficult to manage the nuances of giving and receiving face. We'll talk a lot more about face throughout this mini course, but let's just begin by saying Chinese generally are not as agreeable as we initially perceive, but they're also not as disingenuous as many will perceive later. So, what do you think are the greatest challenges for doing business in China? What adjustments should you make when most of the cultural dimensions of the people you're communicating with are actually at opposite ends of the spectrum? I believe the greatest challenge for effective communications in China is something very basic and fundamental. And the good news is, it's something that is 100% within your control. It's your mindset. It's your desire to align values rather than change them. It's your ability to properly manage your own expectations. Have principles, but don't expect others to share them. In the world of cross-cultural communications, you should never expect that there are universal values. Of course, some universal values may exist, but in the context of how they are perceived and acted upon is often quite different. So don't assume. Most people also lack self-awareness to some degree or another, and it's also important to focus on having empathy about what other people feel, how they think, and what they value. Not having enough empathy is one of the greatest challenges for cross-cultural communications. And it is especially important in China because the cultural implications of giving and receiving face are so personal and complicated. So, if we all lack some self-awareness and empathy, what are the most common mistakes we might make during our cross-cultural communications? And what common mistakes can easily be avoided? The most common mistake I've seen foreigners make is to explain things with the wrong mindset. They seem to feel being emphatic will better get their point across, but they fail to realize certain requests simply don't fit into the Chinese mindset. This is because of the way we express things and the way they're interpreted in the Chinese mind. Chinese logic is quite different. It's not about right or wrong, it's just different. It's often described as linear thinking versus circular thinking, or trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. So we will talk much more about linear versus circular thinking throughout this course. I will also advise you not to ask leading questions. Forcing anyone into an uncomfortable position, especially with your Western logic, will be self-defeating, and it won't convince anyone that you are right. And due to the Chinese culture of giving face, you might just be misled when it appears everyone has acquiesced to your demands. So be cautious and don't be fooled. And finally, try not to show too many emotions. especially negative ones that reflect having a low EQ. This is not only counterproductive, but it would also be perceived very negatively on your personal character. And it is irrelevant that you might perceive many Chinese as having a low EQ. Culturally speaking, EQ is just not part of the culture as we understand it. Now that we've discussed some common mistakes and misperceptions, it's time to give you my killer tips. And I want you to try to imagine the context of how these tips might change the perception of others. The first killer tip is to focus on listening. But not just listening, it's important to learn how to listen in the proper cultural context. Listening in context requires imagination and a purpose-driven curiosity to ask why, but never judge what. Second, you should always try to be empathetic towards the individuals, the people, because making good impressions is what will enable you to achieve your long-term goals in China. And finally, we will say this over and over, never be judgmental. Being judgmental is the first and worst negative impression you can make in any cross-cultural interaction. Congratulations! You have finished the formal portion of the first lesson. And as I promised, you can now watch a short video of me brainstorming about this same topic. I will probably say many different things, but that's okay. It's all intended to give you more angles and ways to develop your imagination and how to create a greater success in China. Again, please ask questions and leave your comments. I will promise to get back to them and respond to you personally. Thank you very much. Hi, I'm just going to record this raw and unrehearsed. What we're going to try to do is we're going to try to share 7 killer tips on the most common business engagements when you do business in China. Now, if you're wondering why you're watching this video or why you received an email with this video, well, there's 2 possible reasons. One is you might have met me at an event and you gave me your business card. So over the last 2 years, while I was living in Shanghai and more recently after I moved back to the United States to Irvine, California, we hosted a lot of events, or I hosted a lot of events, and all the events were related to doing business in China or cross-cultural performance. And if we exchanged a business card, that might be one of the reasons why you're receiving this email and watching this video. The other is you might have been curious because you went to my website or you received some information and you're curious on what is a CLD or a China Leadership Dilemma, and you're curious how I might be able to help you overcome those. So the main purpose of this first video, again, I don't have any video editors. I'm recording this with my iPhone. So I'm not going to try to make a fancy video. What I want to try to do is I want to try to share some valuable information for people who are doing business in China specifically, but the principles that we as Americans use to be successful in China, I think can be extended to basically anything. So the first thing that I want to just, since this is an introduction video, I want to just briefly go over what we call CLD. Whenever we talk about something here at EME, we're going to be talking about how do we solve our CLDs, or our China Leadership Dilemmas. And basically what a China Leadership Dilemma is when you experience an unexpected outcome. And you experience this unexpected outcome because your normal ways of thinking, working, behaving, your normal attitude, everything that you've grown up and been accustomed to, well, when you go to a cross-cultural environment, and especially if you go from the United States or America to China, people aren't going to perceive you the same. There are vast cultural differences. People have different values and people are motivated differently. So your normal modus operandi of leading people or communicating with people, it won't work. It just simply doesn't work. It may work in the short term, because if you're a foreigner in China, you may get a lot of lip service. So everybody will kind of nod their head and kind of agree with what you're saying, but over the long run, you're going to start to experience things that were unpredictable and unexpected. unexpected because you thought the meeting went well, and then how come you're not getting a call back, or how come people aren't behaving the way that you'd expect? Okay. So that is basically, in a nutshell, what a China leadership dilemma is. Of course, we have a lot of articles and maybe other videos that will get more into detail about China leadership dilemmas. But the purpose of this series of videos is basically it's intended for people who have no China experience. But I think it can help a lot of people, because I've met a lot of people who have many years of China experience, and they're still myopic. They still lack self-awareness, cultural awareness, situational awareness, and they're still dumbfounded or befuddled why they can't seem to get their local employees, if they're Chinese, to behave a certain way. So this leads to a lot of misunderstandings about doing business in China. It also leads to a lot of negative attitudes. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in this series of video lessons, and these are really tips. So these tips basically, if you can adopt these tips, they just kind of get you started on a more positive trajectory. Because, they say that you can only have one chance to make a first impression. So most people, if they're completely unaware of Chinese culture and Chinese values, they're unaware how they are perceived, and they're unaware that they are actually not really using the right approach to form long-term relationships, to generate trust with the people they're trying to work with or to cooperate with. So that's a bit of an introduction. The first, what we call lesson 101, is basically about communications. Communications is the most basic way that we communicate with our customers, with our employees, with our stakeholders, with our partners. And Communications 101 is basically understanding what are the main challenges when I go to China, or even if let's say I sell products on Amazon and I source my products from China, and I've hired a Chinese intermediary that I have to communicate with to try to get the product specifications defined, the quality that I need, and all of these things, and that involves or requires some communication. So in this first tip, or killer tips for doing business in China, we're going to talk about kind of just very basic Communications 101. And the first thing to understand is, what are the challenges? Why is it more difficult to communicate with Chinese? It's not, from our point of view, it's not really about language. And if you listen to some of our other videos or read some of our other articles, learning to speak Chinese doesn't mean you know what to say in Chinese. So it's not so much about language. It's really about, alignment of values. So Chinese values are drastically different than American values. And it's also about expectations. Okay, so when you do something a certain way, when you present yourself in a certain way, when you offer some kind of gesture of goodwill, you naturally have an expectation of how people will reciprocate. And this works in both directions. So it's not just you communicating with Chinese, presenting an offer and having a certain level of expectation, but it's also when Chinese are communicating back to you, they also have a certain level of expectation. The problem is those values and their expectations are, in many cases, they're just simply misaligned. You may not experience any negative ramifications in the short term, but over the course of the long term, for example, you're assigned in China and you're leading a new team of local employees, well, everything is great in the beginning because we call that the honeymoon period. But over the course of time, you start to feel that people are not behaving or responding as you would like or as you would expect. And that's basically a China leadership dilemma. And I would say that it's on you. One thing that I find that foreigners often do is they blame the Chinese for their attitudes. They blame certain things that are out of their control instead of taking a look at themselves and realizing that, well, yeah, maybe it wasn't the right attitude, mindset, and approach that I used in the way that I communicated or the way that I tried to build my team. So really the tip is you really have to learn to listen. But it's not just so much listening to hear, but it's listening in context. Because everything in China has a different context. And this is where we get into the development of soft skills. Self-awareness. Do you know how you are perceived by other people? Other types of awareness. There's cultural awareness. There's situational awareness. Are you able to have empathy? Empathy basically means you understand what other people value and what other people feel. And if you can't be empathetic to the people you are communicating with or negotiating with, then basically you're putting yourself at a disadvantage for achieving your goals. China, often we always say, to the eyes of a foreigner, China is often a land of contradictions. So you read about all of these things, and then when you're actually interacting with Chinese, they appear nothing as you would expect. They're very aggressive, they're very energetic. They might even be very opinionated. They're very individualistic. So a lot of that is contradictory to things that we may have learned about traditional Chinese culture that dates back to thousands of years of history. So we're not going to be able to get into a lot of the cultural differences in this video, but the tip is when you're negotiating on behalf of your company with somebody who represents another company, make sure you always focus on the individual. Make sure you focus on what does this individual have to gain personally if we're successful in forming a partnership between organizations. So when I talk about that, so I don't want you to get the wrong idea. It's not about giving kickbacks or doing something that is illegal or corrupt. It's just you really have to think that the individual is the important person that you're negotiating with. Yes, this individual represents a company that you want to do business with, but it's always a great tip to focus on the individuals. It could just be compliments. It could just be recognition. It could just be friendship. It could just be an opportunity to learn from a foreigner, have early access to new technology or new ways of doing business. It's whatever might be beneficial for the individual. You just have to remember, goodwill isn't always the exchange of money. It's the exchange of other things of value that people might appreciate. In fact, just showing appreciation is also something that you want to demonstrate towards the individual. The final tip for communications is to never be judgmental. And that's probably the hardest thing to do because people are naturally judgmental. When you see something that you think is unethical or you think is poor behavior, even if you think it's something like poor sportsmanship, how do you not be judgmental? Okay, so this is where it comes down to the beginning, is where you don't really understand the situation in its proper context. A lot of times it's the proper cultural context. And that all originates from lacking cultural awareness or lacking situational awareness. So the series of videos that we're going to do, we're going to talk about a lot of different common business engagements when people do business with Chinese or when they go to China to do business. Communications is the basic one. So hopefully what we've done in this very short video, I don't want to make these too long, is just give you some tips on improving your communications. But it's really just improving how you are perceived by the people you are communicating with. And if you're perceived in a more positive way, that may give you an advantage, especially if your goal is to build long-term relationships and achieve long-term results and outcomes. Okay? So thank you for watching this first video. Again, this is just take number one. We're not going to rehearse it. We're not going to edit it. We're just going to basically go by the information that we presented in the email and kind of expand upon it, give it a little bit more context. And hopefully through these videos, you can get to know me personally a little bit better, because one of the things that we also want to do is we want to hear your questions. We want you to leave comments. We want you to ask questions. We want you to challenge things that you don't agree with, because only through that engagement, understanding the issues that you have, will we be able to develop the right solutions in our teaching and our coaching. Okay? Thank you very much. This is video number 1.